Hi there, Science 10. So what I'm going to cover today is of relevance to your ecosystem photo tour, and I want to talk a little bit about the photo tour as well. So just to be clear that there's an understanding, I'm looking for you to go out to a site of your choosing that is outside, that is in nature, that maybe has been a bit modified by people, or maybe in your view it's pretty much pristine. And then to identify it, to tell me, hey, based on the information you've given, which biogeoclimatic zone is it in, and to write about it. Take photographs of it, put that in your presentation, and to write about the organisms that live there based on your research, based on your knowledge, and how humans have interacted with that ecosystem. There are lots of examples that are given. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's a couple of exemplars that I uploaded with the project, and I think that can help. One little thing, in case it's causing any kind of stress with anyone, I was thinking about it. I'm not looking for you to be identifying any individual plants to species. You can try, that's great, but I don't want to put that pressure on you. I would like you to know your trees. That's a good skill to have. There's resources out there that you can ID trees with, and I can help with that. All right, that being said, lesson 5 on energy in the environment. Of course, this unit, the topic of the unit is energy, and so we've looked at different kinds of energy transformations, doing calculations with energy. A thing to realize about nature is it's beautiful and everything, but you can also view it as one more arena that for energy exchange. Some organisms gain energy from their environment, gain energy from each other. We look here for the notes at different classifications, ways organisms are described based on how they get energy. So first of all, some things to know about energy that are really relevant to ecosystems would be the first 2 laws of thermodynamics. One, that energy can't be created or destroyed. You kind of got a gist of that, I think, already in the worksheet, because I had that example where we have something falling from a really tall tree, 1 kilogram weight. And I hope it was becoming clear to some of you that as the object fell, it was going faster. But it was also losing gravitational potential energy. In fact, there was in ideal conditions, there was a 1-to-1 conversion right there. All the gravitational potential energy being converted into kinetic energy as the object fell. By contrast, if you were to throw an object up into the air, it would slow down as it went higher up, but be gaining gravitational potential energy. Energy can change forms but not be created or destroyed. But the kicker with energy is that when it undergoes transformations, it's actually not always perfect in that way, because what happens is that whenever you do have an energy transformation, some energy is lost. No energy transformations are perfect. There's always energy that's lost to other forms in any conversion. And that energy, by the second law of thermodynamics, is lost as heat. Here, I'll show you an example of a simple device for energy transformation. You've seen it before. It's the Newton's cradle. So let's back up a little bit, put this over here, and go. So we see over time, as the cradle is swinging, we're getting the same process repeating itself over and over again. The momentum of one ball here causes a pulse, force to go through all the ones in the middle, and then that pulse causes this last ball here to go up in the air. But what's of relevance to the second law of thermodynamics is that you can't leave these things overnight and you get back in the morning and they're still going. Because what happens with every hit is that, yes, some of that energy is transmitted through to the last ball, which is then thrown up. But there's other energy which is that's just lost for other things. Each of these strikes creates a small amount of heat. And there's other things at play as well. The balls jiggle back and forth, and there's sound being released. There's other forms of energy that there's loss when we're going from the conversion of this gravitational potential energy to this kinetic energy to this gravitational potential energy on the other side. Energy is lost in any transformation, and that applies to ecosystems as well. So some key terms I'm looking for you to have down for this as well. One is the concept of a producer. Well, a producer is just any organism that makes its own food from non-living sources. So, deer, people, foxes, and so forth. These are all animals, and they all make their own food. They don't make their own food. They derive their food from living things, either other organisms or they derive their food from either things that eat plants or they eat plants themselves. By contrast, producers, plants, can get their energy source from sunlight or from some chemicals that occur naturally in the environment. Much of the biosphere is actually covered in organisms that don't capture energy from light. You might think producer equals plant, but actually, if you look at the bottom of the ocean, most of the producers, organisms that are making their own food from non-living sources, are bacteria, and they're just using chemicals. But if you look outside today at the trees around you, you're seeing producers, and they're getting their energy from a very simple reaction called photosynthesis, which you've probably learned about before. But I'd like to show you the chemical equation for photosynthesis. Specifically, I want to show you the balanced chemical equation for photosynthesis, because now you know what a balanced chemical equation is, and it's here. 6 carbon dioxide. Well, I'll back up and say the skeleton equation is carbon dioxide plus water. That's a word equation. Produces sugar plus oxygen. And this only happens with sunlight. So sometimes people will, inside this little equation right here, they'll put plus sunlight. Even though the sunlight's not actually a chemical, it's needed for the process to happen. To balance the chemical equation, we need 6 CO2s. Why? Because sugar, glucose, has got this formula, C6H12O6. It's a big molecule with 6 carbons and 12 hydrogens and also 6 oxygens. So you're going to need, to balance that, you're going to need 6 CO2 on this side. And then there's 6 H2O, just one of these molecules, and 6 oxygen. The oxygen, by the way, is a big bonus. There was hardly any oxygen in the atmosphere until plants came along. In fact, if you look back hundreds of millions of years in the fossil record, or even billions of years really in the fossil record, you'll find eventually there was a time when there were no plants and there was very little oxygen in the atmosphere, and that had, when oxygen came around, had a huge effect on the geology, on the rocks. That's photosynthesis. Consumers do the opposite thing. Consumers take those substances, they take that sugar or substances that have glucose in them, or maybe molecules that have been made from glucose, proteins and so forth, fats. It all ultimately comes from the glucose that comes from photosynthesis, the sugar. And they take that, the simplified one, the one that you're always going to be shown first, is what happens when you take glucose and you use it as an energy source, that sugar glucose. And it's just the opposite. C6H12O6 plus oxygen, right? The stuff we breathe in, we need for cellular respiration. Without it, we die very quickly. Produces water and carbon dioxide. I should put it this way. 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O. This explains why we need oxygen so much, because it's crucial for cellular respiration, especially in your brain. Your brain, the fuel for your brain is glucose, sugar. And it also explains why, among other reasons, when you breathe out, you're breathing oxygen. Another waste product of the human body, of course, is urine, and has lots of water. I meant to say when you breathe out, you're breathing out water as well. It condenses. A decomposer is any consumer that has an energy source being dead or decaying matter. So classic example of that would be fungi. Bacteria are extremely important as decomposers, and also earthworms are often given as an example of a decomposer. They are in a way decomposers, but maybe not the best example, but it's a good hands-on example, right? A worm. But bacteria are the majority of the biomass in most ecosystems, or they're up there with animals and plants. And so they're extremely important for decomposing. If we didn't have bacteria, those nutrient cycles that bring nitrogen and carbon and other nutrients back available for plants to be used, they would stay locked in the soil. We need those decomposers, bacteria, to make that happen. So that's more about matter cycles, but there's one thing I wanted to show you right now about sugar. Well, two things. It's right here. I'll start with this. So what I have right here is something that my Science 9 students made last semester. I told them at that time, hey, let's just see if we can get roots to grow from a cutting of a jade plant. So I got some jade plant cuttings from my house, and we got that going. And I said, hey, how about we look to see if fertilizer will make it better? So I took some fertilizer. They took some fertilizer and added it to the soil, to the water, and had the jade plant dipped in there. And nothing happened for a really long time, and most of them died. But this one, with water kept around it, it was watered a bit better, did just fine. What you're seeing when you're looking in there is you're seeing that the jade plant cutting has set roots into the water. The water happens to have fertilizer in it. And you're seeing a whole bunch of other things that just came along for the ride. Presumably in that cutting, maybe on the surface of the stem or maybe on the stem of this wild shrub right here, there must have been some really small amounts of algae. And it's actually now the algae that's really taken over this water right here. So a bit of fertilizer in the water has caused all this growth here of algae inside the Erlenmeyer flask. It looks a bit yucky, but to my mind, this is awesome. It's a little miniature ecosystem that just happened to be successful over the period of several months just in front of the window. Of course, we needed the window, didn't we? Because not only did we need the water, but we also needed the light. This algae wouldn't be here if it weren't for the sunlight as an energy source. The green color of the algae and the fact that it grew in the first place shows us that photosynthesis has happened there successfully in the window. The other thing I wanted to show you was, well, it comes to this right here, the glucose. I wanted to demonstrate the energy content of glucose, sugar. And often people will just say, well, obviously it's got a high energy content. It's in our food. It gives us lots of energy when we eat it. But I thought, let's do a kind of more of a chemical demonstration. So this was going to have to happen in the fume hood. So I'm going to pause the video here and start it up after I'm ready for the demo. All right, so I was thinking, how are we going to show the high energy content of sugar? The first thing that came to mind was just to burn some, but I didn't really want to set off a smoke alarm in the school, and I thought it'd be a little more interesting to show you an example of energy being released from sugar without a flame. So here's the materials I have for this. It's going to happen in the fume hood. We've got some common everyday sugar, household sugar. High concentration sulfuric acid. This is why that's happening in the fume hood. And a source of abundant oxygen, hydrogen peroxide, also used for elephant's toothpaste. So I'm going to start by adding a bit of the sulfuric acid. 5 milliliters is plenty. What's interesting about this reaction is, as well, is it shows you how effective it is to add a source of oxygen. Watch what happens when I just put the sugar into the sulfuric acid, only sulfuric acid. All right. So we've got a color change happening right there, but really, there's not a whole lot going on. I won't put my nose up to it, but I'll bet if I were to put my nose up to it, I would notice a slight caramelly smell. Now we're going to add our oxygen source. All right, that happened even too fast to show you guys. The hydrogen peroxide, especially in a warmer environment, releases in a decomposition reaction an awful lot of oxygen. That sugar is what's being oxidized by the oxygen that's released by the hydrogen peroxide, sorry. And that's what's going on. A lot of reactions like this happen a bit more readily in an acidic environment. However, we're also seeing that the acid seems to be involved in the reaction as well. Can I tell you the overall balance equation for that? That would be tricky because there's a lot of reactions happening there, not least because the sugar is probably not entirely burning or combusting. But one of the dominant reactions is clearly that pure carbon is being formed. How do I know it's pure carbon, or almost pure carbon? Because I did it earlier. And this is what I got. Which is cool in itself, right? It demonstrates the C part in the C6H12O6. Shows us that sugar has carbon as a major component of the molecule. The other thing I wanted you to see is bring in this connection of energy in ecosystems. The concepts of the food chain and the food pyramid are really important here. In previous years, you've probably seen food webs, which basically is a who's who of an ecosystem. Which organisms are eating which other organisms. Food chains are a bit more of a hierarchy because it demonstrates the nature of energy flow in an ecosystem, from the producers to the consumers, but not just the consumers, towards what are called the higher level consumers. Those organisms that are predators may be on other predators. Here are two examples of food chains. Most of the earth is covered by oceans, so I thought I should show a couple. One, for grassland. In a grassland, the major producers are grasses, hardly a surprise. Insects are actually really important as plant-eating organisms in that kind of environment. Now they have their own food web, insects and insects that eat insects and so forth, but there are, of course, animals that eat the insects as well. Sparrows being one of them in any grassland. Sparrows eat seeds as well. It's a complicated place, but they do eat the insects. And, of course, there are organisms that eat the sparrows themselves. So this here, simplified, is an example of a food chain that you might see in grassland. From grass to grasshopper to sparrow to hawk. But in a marine environment, you can get food chains that have, in fact, even more levels than that. Here's an example of a food chain for an ocean environment. We start with algae, which are tiny, single-celled plants. Right here, in fact, you can't really see them individually. The little green guys, basically the green slime there, is not a single plant. It's actually probably millions of those tiny organisms, those tiny individual plants, algae. Now, that kind of algae is probably not found in the ocean, but the ocean is full of different kinds of algae. In fact, what are called terrestrial plants, like trees and grasses, they don't grow in the ocean with a few very rare exceptions. That is then eaten by what are called plankton. Plankton are often the juvenile forms of some larger marine organisms. The young ones, right? They start life small, and then the plankton might be eaten, for example, by krill or shrimp or some kind of larger invertebrate, which in turn is eaten by small fish, which in turn are eaten by larger fish, and of course larger fish themselves are often eaten by even larger fish or other organisms like dolphin and killer whales. Marine or in general aquatic ecosystems often have a lot of levels. But a thing to consider here, to remember, is that each of these here represents an energy transformation. One thing feeding on another is a transformation of energy from the one organism to another. And that organism, when they eat that organism, the other one, has gained chemical potential energy by doing that. They've made that part of them. And the organism as food represents chemical energy for the other organism that eats it to go about its daily business of moving around and reproducing and so forth. These arrows all represent energy transformations. But key point for the food pyramid, last part of today's notes, is that those energy transformations are never 100% efficient. There is never a 100% energy transfer from one level of a food chain to another. So, well, people think about, say, forests, and when you think of a forest, you're probably going to think of moose, deer, bear, that kind of thing. You probably noticed that those animals are very hard to find. They're relatively rare. Even the smaller animals like birds and warblers, they're not super common relative to the trees and the plants. There's a lot more of the producers because of this property of the second law of thermodynamics, that in energy transformation, energy is lost as heat. The energy, the abiotic energy, the non-living energy, enters the ecosystem through the producers. Here we have a fictional example where our grass in this ecosystem has made 100,000 joules of energy. Remember, the joule is a unit of energy. Grasshoppers here are the consumers on the grass. They consume it, and there is a loss as heat. Like specifically, the amount of heat loss with each transformation in ecosystem is about 90%. As you go from every level of the food chain to the next up, the general rule of thumb is that only 10% of that food energy, that chemical potential energy, can go up to the next level. The remaining 90% is lost as heat, is the way it's expressed. Now, of course, if you have a food chain that has lots and lots of levels, this means that energy is really going to peter out as you get towards the top. It's called a food pyramid, but really, it's not pyramid shaped. It's more like this sort of a shape, kind of coming to a very sharp point for the organisms that are at the top of the food chain. This is why, as the saying goes, for biologists, big, fierce animals are very rare. I mean, they're very big, so they have high energy needs, but also the energy transformations that are needed to them are very inefficient. And as you go up to the food chain, there's less and less of those kinds of organisms that can be supported by the environment. Let's go up another level in the food chain. We go from grasshoppers to sparrows. In our grasshoppers, we had 10,000 joules of energy. The sparrows only get 10% of that because 90% is lost as heat. Now the sparrows are down to 1,000 joules of energy, and for the hawk, it only gets 10% of that. It gets just 100 joules. So while the energy content of the grass was 100,000 joules, the content available to the hawk just 100 joules. So anyways, that's really all I want you to know about energy and ecosystems. And I'm hoping that this can be useful to you in some ways when you're writing up your ecosystem photo tour projects that I hope that you're getting at fairly soon.